He had gotten pissed. He laughed so rarely these days, and one of his few moments of joy had been interrupted. He'd seen, through the window in the door, a woman holding her hands up to her screaming face. She'd looked like she was trying to block out the sound of her own shrieking noise. He hadn't blamed her for that. She'd stood in the parking lot beside her blue Chrysler with the door open and her keyring pressed against her cheek. He'd let out an aggravated sigh and looked down at the cash drawer. It had opened a few inches. He'd pulled it, and actually had to pull hard since the holder was misshapen from the hit he had given it. He'd scooped out the cash quickly and fingered it with both hands, smearing some blood on the bills, and he had stopped when he had counted to just over $200. There had still been several greenbacks to count, but he knew he had more than enough for a while, and he could easily get more if he needed to. Besides, there had been something to take care of before his ears started to bleed. He'd opened the door to the office and headed toward the woman in the lot. When she had seen him coming, her screaming stopped, and she tried to get back into her car. He had been at her before she could finish bending at the waist. He kicked the open door into her. It had snapped both of her shin bones. The door quickly bounced off of her and propped itself open again, vibrating less and less violently. Her legs had given out, and as she had started to go down, he kicked the door a second time. That time the top of the door made an impact with her neck, and he'd heard something pop. The sides of her knees had been hit with the bottom of the door slamming into her. The door had propped back open again, and she fell to the ground and curled up in a fetal position. She had lain there, retching soundlessly and clawing at her throat. "Better," he'd said, watching her body spasm. He'd looked up and saw a face disappear behind a curtain in the window of the room in front of him. It was room number 2. "Curiosity killed the cat, and you ain't getting no satisfaction." He'd gotten in his truck and started it up. He'd put it in reverse and backed up behind the woman's blue car. He had gotten out and walked back up to her. She was then lying perfectly still. He'd left the truck idling. He'd pulled the keyring off her finger and let her hand fall back to the concrete. Her knuckles had clacked against it. He'd gotten into her Chrysler and found the car's key. He'd left the door open and pulled the car forward. The back wheel had rolled over the dead woman's upper arm. Her fingers had clenched reflexively when the tire crushed her forearm. Cars could park nose to nose, indicated by the lines painted on the lot, but there had only been 4 cars there at that time, not counting his truck. All the cars had been parked side by side. Their headlights faced empty spaces in the first row of rooms. The second row of rooms faced their passenger sides. Overhead, the motel looked like a big T. The 2 buildings were not connected. A sidewalk separated them. He'd backed her car up to the edge of the lot. Room number 2 had been about 25 feet away, straight ahead. He'd put the car into park and put the gas pedal to the floor. The engine had roared, and a light smoke had come out from under the hood. "Here, kitty kitty," he'd said as he put the car in drive. He'd felt the G-force begin as he crashed through the window and the wall of room number 2. The pot-bellied man inside had been wearing a wife-beater and boxers. He'd been wide-eyed and open-mouthed against the room's back wall. The car's speed had not been slowed by the impact, and the front bumper tipped the whole bed over and propelled it, mattress first, into the man. The force had thrown it into him so that only his hairy legs and feet showed below it. Before the bed could fall to the floor, the car had slammed into the bottom of the box spring. The bed and the second wall had stopped the car. He had left his foot on the gas for a few seconds more, listening to the engine whining under the crumpled hood. He had seen the plaster in the wall behind the bed start to split, and lightning bolt cracks forked their way towards the ceiling. He had taken his foot off the pedal, but left the car in drive as he'd gotten out. His boots had crunched on the room's rubble. He'd walked up to the bed, and had peered in to see between the mattress and the wall. The man had been still. The squashed bit of him he had been able to see anyway. His bare feet were still, too, and a line of blood had begun to trail down one leg. All that hair on that leg had slowed its trickling journey. Out of his own sense of curiosity, he'd gotten back in the car and put it in reverse. The damaged vehicle had reluctantly pulled backward, and the bed had fallen onto the hood and then slid to the floor. The man had still been standing, propped up in the cracked wall. He couldn't tell if he'd killed the man by smothering or if he had crushed him to death. The man's arms slowly had fallen back to his sides. His eyes had been closed, and his head had started to loll forward. His back had come loose next, and then his entire body freed from the imprint in the wall. He had fallen forward and landed in a sprawl on the floor by the bed. While staring at the semi-human shape in the wall, he'd giggled to himself and thought about how that was only supposed to happen in cartoons. He had gotten back out of the car and walked back into the lot and toward the office. He'd gone in to where the mangled register, knocked-over service bell, and corpse were, and checked the one thing he had not disturbed, the check-in registration. The log had indicated that there were only 3 guests staying there, including him. The clerk had signed him in as truck-driving cowboy and put the date and time. He'd flipped back and checked the previous couple of weeks. There hadn't been many names. He had wanted to see if anyone was staying long-term. Nobody was. There had been a check mark and another date showing when each name had checked out, except on last night's page. Those had been the only guests that had still been there. The woman with the blue car had just arrived to check in. Room 1 had been empty. Room 2 had been occupied by wife-beater Honda No English. Room 3 had been his room. Room 4 had been empty. Room 5 had been written in pretty penmanship of the actual guest, Mary Ann Steiner. She had a check mark in more recent time by her name. She had already checked out. A few more rooms had been listed as empty until Room 9, Guitar Guy, Red Tonka, had occupied it. If Guitar Guy had stayed in rooms 6 through 8, which faced the back of the first building, the stem of the T, he might have left it alone. Unfortunately for Guitar Guy, room 9 through 11 faced the parking lot and had a great view of the events that had taken place. Guitar Guy had to be paid a little visit. He had dropped the log where he was standing, stepped over it as he exited the office, and crossed the parking lot to room 9's door. He had sensed only stillness and calm behind that door. Still, he had put all his weight on his right leg and brought up his left. He'd kicked the door in with it. The locks had splintered the frame and the door had swung open. The doorknob had punched a hole in the wall. Guitar Guy had been lying on his back on the bed. The guitar had been on the floor beside it. He had seen the guy's chest rise and fall, deeply and slowly. The guy had been wearing blue jeans and sunglasses, and headphones that had been distantly playing some tinny hairband metal music on his ears. He'd approached the guy and stared down at him. The guy had taken another deep breath, his fifth since he had broken into the room. He'd looked at the nightstand and seen an empty, dingy-looking hypodermic needle in the ashtray. When the guy inhaled his sixth breath, he leaned over him and placed his massive hands on either side of the guy's face. He had placed his thumbs on each lens of the mirrored sunglasses. When the guy had exhaled again, he crunched the lenses and tightened his grip until his thumbs were pressing on the guy's unseen and unseeing eyes. He had wormed his thumbs between the firmly shut lids. The eyeballs had felt smooth and rubbery underneath them. The guy's body had begun to thrash helplessly. The arms and legs had flailed aimlessly. He had pressed a little harder and felt the eyes squish and separate into clumpy pieces. He'd rubbed his thumbs along the bony sockets and explored them. He pressed harder still and felt, and heard, the bottoms of the little socket bowls break open, and then his thumbs mashed into a substance he had felt many times before. It felt like scrambled eggs with warm maple syrup on them. It was the brain matter. The thrashing had ceased. He'd yanked his thumbs out of the dead guy's ocular cavities. There had been a popping sound when the suction had been broken. He'd stood up straight and stared at the blood and bubbles that had come out from under the broken lenses, down over his temples, pooled in his ears, and when they had filled, they overflowed and dripped steadily onto the pillow and absorbed into the stuffing. The novelty of the kill had worn off quickly, so he turned and walked out. He'd whistled on his way back to the truck, making up a tune as he went. He'd driven away feeling a twinge of anxiety at not knowing whom that fourth car belonged to. He hadn't been about to search every room. He'd been so tired already so early in the day. The next day, he'd heard on the radio that a young girl had seen a bit of what had happened. She had been in room 11, the reporter had said. She described a big man with scraggly, shoulder-length hair who drove a beat-up gray pickup truck. "Lucky bitch," he'd said. "Why weren't you signed in? Probably giving it to the clerk for a free room. Am I right?" She had cried through her entire interview and hadn't seen much of the killings. He figured she just hid under her covers, or in the bathroom. He hadn't even sensed her. In Arizona, he had slept in the truck, just in case that bit of news was making him famous. He couldn't believe how much he could get away with from state to state. Hell, from city to city. Some of the news had gone national, but mostly each area was concerned with what went on in that area only. The news would only give snippets about what went on in the rest of the outside world. The outside world was them, not us. That could never happen to us. At Ahab's Gas, he'd tried to fill the tank, but he needed to pay first before the pump would be activated. He'd gone inside to pay the clerk. It had just been easier. The clerk had been a young black man whose button-up blue shirt had a name tag that said to call him Leon. He'd reached into his pocket to pay Leon, but there was only lint in there. He had shaken it off his hand and checked his jeans' other 3 pockets. They had been empty too. "Damn it! I know I've got it here somewhere," he'd said to Leon. Leon looked very nervous. Was all he'd been able to say. He had just had the cash. He had been sure of it. He had wadded it all up together, but he must have dropped it somewhere. He had shrugged at Leon. "Guess I can't pay you now." What? Leon had managed. His spirit hadn't really been into it, but Leon's increasing jitteriness had been beginning to make him uneasy, so he had broken Leon's neck. The security cameras were high overhead, so all they could see was the top of his hat. He had left the store with a brown paper bag full of beef jerky, Twinkies, hot dogs, a loaf of bread, Caffey Wakes, and a six-pack of Coors on the bottom. He knew that beer wouldn't make him sleepy. He was no lightweight. He'd cradled the bag in his left arm and carried a six-pack of Coke in his right hand. He dropped everything into the passenger seat through the open window. Life knew better than he did. It had arranged for him to be alone in the store, and had given him no choice but to kill, and he'd gotten all those goodies as his reward. He'd gotten back in the truck, and then he was off again. Commercial Road seemed to go on forever. He felt like he must have driven past the freeway by then, but he knew he couldn't have passed it without noticing. All the land and surroundings looked the same. None of it was any more familiar than the rest. He was beginning to feel more and more agitated. The radio was still blasting advertisements and yammering endlessly. He was starting to reflect on recent past events compulsively, playing things over and over in his head, either making every scenario come out perfectly or over-dramatizing what was going to go wrong from his slip-ups. That little sneaky bitch in the motel gave a damn good description of him. He looked up to make sure a chopper wasn't following him overhead. Of course there wasn't. He was just being paranoid. He was in a different state after all by that point. He needed to focus on the person he really needed to kill, and not on all the wasted time. He could do that, and feel a bit better, if the goddamn station would just play another fucking song anytime soon. He didn't want to surf for another station because he had earlier, and they were all playing shit, except for that one. An ad for Sears window replacement started, and he growled and raged and punched the radio with his right fist. The dial cracked, and the fast select knobs fell to the floor. Worst of all, the power volume knob disappeared somewhere into the console, and he was stuck listening to the noise at an even louder level. "God fucking damn it!" he yelled out. He leaned over to see how he could turn it off, since punching wasn't working. He could see the knob jammed into the back of the radio. He stuck one large finger into the hole and tried to pop it back out. His body was suddenly slammed into the wheel and his head smacked into the dashboard. He instinctively hit the brake and sat up. The world spun around once, and the side of the truck crashed into the wall of rock in the other lane. He stared out the windshield, confused and breathing heavily from the surprise. The night was quiet beyond the idling truck. He shut off the engine noise to confirm that. He heard another engine in the near distance. He had to get out of the passenger side, since the driver's side was slammed up against a mountain wall. He brushed the bag of goods onto the floor and crawled out. About 30 feet down the road was a white Toyota truck. Its brake lights glowed red from the oncoming lane. He couldn't see who was behind the wheel. He approached the pathetic excuse for a man's truck. The front end of it was slightly dented, but the engine was purring still. A balding man in a business suit staggered out. The man was in a daze and wobbled on his feet. He had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding slightly. He did not seem to notice. "Are you okay?" the man began. He grabbed the man's tie and threw him headfirst into the wall of rock on the other side of the road. The man fell to the ground and landed on his back. The man's face was a shapeless mess of red. He rifled through the man's pockets and found a full money clip and wallet. He turned to walk back to his truck when he heard something. Music. It was awful. It was some kind of fruity techno shit. Still, it was a working stereo. He then realized that the gray truck's radio had gone dead in the crash. The rambling commercials had been silenced. He was surprised he hadn't noticed right away. He looked at the white truck, and then back at the gray one. It already had the look of a memory. He knew it was finished. "Bye, old girl," he said to it. He got into the Toyota and pushed the eject button on the CD player. He threw the disc out like a mini frisbee. He pushed the radio button. Some light rock shit came blaring out of the speakers. He pressed the search button and found the station he liked on the digital display, and Stairway to Heaven started from the beginning. He smiled. He looked at the fuel gauge and saw the tank was approaching the empty mark. He would drive back to Ahab's Gas and fill up on gas and supplies again. If the place was crawling with cops, he would go to the next station. He knew he would make it. He was glad to be driving a vehicle that the cops weren't looking for. He didn't need any more delays. He knew going back to Ahab's would be the final one. He didn't mind, though. Life had given him a new truck.